Hello, my name is Ryan Hum, and today we're going to talk about the relationship between income and health. So everyone can understand that there is some sort of relationship between income and health. You could intrinsically understand that poor people may live a little bit less than rich people. Rich people have a higher life expectancy. So a simple way to look at this is using Hans Rosling's graphs. Okay? But we're going to simplify it even more. He made a log linear graph, but let's not talk about that. Let's talk about simple life expectancy and income. On one axis, you have life expectancy, and then your x-axis is income. In this case, it's GDP per capita, the same as Hans Rosling. And for any given year, the relationship is going to look something like this. Okay? You could see at the very bottom here, very small increases in income have this dramatic impact on life expectancy. If you shift just a little bit this way, your life expectancy skyrockets to about here. For high-income countries, there's very little difference between the poorest of the high-income countries and the highest of the high-income countries. Very little difference in the life expectancy. So this relationship has held over the years. But one demographer named Samuel Preston in 1975 wrote this phenomenal article that really criticized this graph. He thought that this could not just be the entire story. In 1975, Sam Preston redrew this graph, but at various decades. So instead of the static graph that you had previously for any given year, we're going to redraw it for multiple years. So same thing, on one axis, life expectancy, on the x-axis, income. So let's take a year like 1940s. 1940s, the graph would look something like this. Same thing that we saw previously. Low-income countries have this dramatic rise in life expectancy. High-income countries have very little rise. So it plateaus out. Let's draw the graph for 1970s. See the little bit of rise that we're seeing? That's really interesting. Let's redraw it for the year 2000. Much larger compared to the 1930s. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing that, yes, there is a relationship between life expectancy and income, but it's changing over time. What we're getting for any level of income is a higher level of life expectancy over time. Now, to me, that means it's way more important to understand what's rising the life expectancy, what's rising these curves over time, than it is to grow economic development and income. Because you get much bigger rises than these little bits here. So what do you think is causing these upward rises? Any ideas? Well, there's a lot of debate about what's causing these upward rises. Some people are saying that standards of living are growing and that you're actually getting better and better health out of that. But others are saying that it could be education. Maybe it's nutrition. But most people think that it's technology that's happening. In the 1700s to the late 1800s, most definitely you had rises in life expectancy based on standard of living. You had diseases like smallpox that were rampant, and you had public health measures that were really starting to come about, like quarantine. We started understanding how diseases were spreading. We didn't know how to control it really, but we could stop the spread a little bit easier with quarantines. Now, things changed much better after that. In the 1880s, to the 1950s or so, you started having these advances in public health. You started understanding germ theory a lot better. You started having this rise of vaccines that started happening, and vaccines are really preventing diseases from coming about. At the same time, low-income countries were still getting this public health message, but at a slower rate. And it was diffusing much slower into these low and middle-income countries. From vaccines, we started getting antibiotics, and antibiotics were not only preventing the disease from what we had with vaccines, but antibiotics were curing the disease afterwards. So you had this trifecta of understanding the disease and the spread of it, how to control it with quarantines. You had, on the other hand, preventing it from happening via vaccines. And then your last prong of attack was curing it afterwards with antibiotics. Now, all this has changed the landscape of infectious diseases to the point where we're having very few deaths of infectious diseases in high-income countries, and that knowledge is translating down to low and middle-income countries. So, we know about vaccinations, we know about germ theory, and we know about antibiotics. Now, previously, all these cost a lot of money, and a lot of technology development has happened over this time period. Remember cell phones? Cell phones used to be this big. They used to cost hundreds of dollars. Now, they're this big, and anyone could get them. The same thing has happened for technologies, specifically medicines and vaccines. What used to cost a lot of money is now costing very little. So let's go back to the Preston curve. On this axis, let's talk about infant survival. And then on this axis, let's talk about income again. We get the same curve that we get for life expectancy. Now let's take it over the decades. Now it's going higher and higher and higher. Now what's interesting is not this upward rise in this case, because there's very little growth here. What's happening is this sideways shift that's happening. So this sideways shift is really saying that it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to live longer. So let's break this down. Let's take this one point here, which is kind of like our slope. And this slope tells us whether or not it's getting cheaper and cheaper. Okay? Let's redraw this graph. This is money. This is how much it costs. And this is time. And you could see that this slope curve is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over the years. Now, what does that mean? That means that more people have access to these medications. More people have access to vaccinations. And fewer dollars are needed to get this technology and to implement it, and ultimately to have greater infant survival in lower and middle income countries.